everybody. Welcome to BCS Chester and North Wales committee meeting. We are joined tonight by Chris Weston, who's the CDIO of Jumar. And Chris has been in tech, I'm sure he won't mind me saying, for over 25 years now, and has occupied several different leadership positions in technology across a very broad range of sectors and organizations. Speaks all over the place, and I'm sure he'll tell you about that, but he's here, there and everywhere. I've been very fortunate to have seen and heard him on a number of times. And he's also co-founder of the WB40 podcast, which hopefully some of you have heard, and still going, Chris, still going strong. What, 200 plus episodes?
230, something like that.
Fantastic. And so I'm going to pass over to Chris now. We've got a very exciting talk about RPA, and what we would love is as much involvement from everybody as we possibly can. So I'm sure Chris will mention as he goes through, but if you can raise hands, ask questions, get involved, it would be great to hear from some of you. And we'll pop up at the end and have a Q&A as well. So Chris, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. So so hello everybody. As you can see, I've started on slide 2. You can see there's IDC at the bottom. Up until about 4 months ago, I was doing CIO advisory work for IDC. We had a sort of CIO community across Europe. Some of you might have heard of that or been involved in that, and if you have, then you'll be well used to me chattering away on Zoom or Teams, etc. If not, a lot of what you'll see is basically a presentation, almost my last act as an IDC advisor. I did a presentation in Croatia to our Adriatics event about digital transformation, automation, and the need for automation to promote resilience in organizations. But before I get onto that, I'll just give you a bit of a potted history of me. So as Martin said, we all look back on our extended careers with increasing dismay, don't we, as a start, but it gets further away. I've been involved in lots of different sides of organization, did lots of different jobs up until things like CIO, CTO roles. Then I went and did some time consulting, doing some work with startups of different types of technology. Learned about that world, very interesting. Then I went, I worked for IDC for a few years doing CIO advisory, and now I'm working for Jumar, who are a company I've known for a long time. A company that have supplied to me when I was running IT in organizations, and had grown quite strongly in recent years. I've known the founder for a long time. She's a fantastic person, and I know that it's the kind of business that does the right things for the right reasons, and the kind of business I was happy to get involved in. So that's what I'm doing now, kind of building their technology strategy, both internally for their own systems, because they're a recruiter among the other things, to make sure that we're efficient and effective as a recruitment company, but also as a technology company, because we have teams like QA and test, we have the Azure practice, we have an architecture practice, we have a software development teams here in the UK and abroad. So a wide range of skills, amongst other things like user-centered design, and the list is almost endless. And my job really is to figure out how well they're delivering their services at the moment and what they're going to be delivering next. What are the things that people are going to be asking us about next year and the year after? And that's really important because, as we all know, the skills gap is pretty it's pretty visible, right? We are running out of the ability to find people on a whim. We really have to hunt to find not just people with the right skills, but people with the right mindset, the right attitude, the right experience. And we can't afford to have lots of different people on the bench. We have to be focused in our delivery. We have to be focused in what we want to do. So that's part of what we're doing. As Martin said, I do speak in different places. I'm a bit weary today, I have to admit, because I've just come back from Cyprus. I did a Digital Cyprus conference this week. But one of the stories of Digital Cyprus conference is that they are there's a country that's trying to do their best to churn out technology graduates, technology skills in their workforce, but they don't have enough people to do the things they want to do as a country, and that includes provide skills and services to countries around them, right? So everybody's in this situation, and we just have to work with it the best we can. So I don't think I'll wrap it on much longer. We can start with this presentation. If you want to turn your cameras on, please do, because it'd be nice to get see a few faces. I do want this to be a bit two-way. I don't want to just blather on about this. It'd be great to get some comments, or raise your hand, or whatever it might be. Put it in chat. Maybe Martin, if somebody comes in chat, if I don't, I might not be able to see if it's in chat, but let me know if there's a question or a comment.
Will do.
A lot of what we'll see is IDC research, and when I was at IDC, I would always question the research, because sometimes you see research which seems a bit, you think, well, am I really seeing that in the world? Am I seeing that in my customers? Am I seeing that in my network? And sometimes there's research with some conclusions drawn from that, which again, you'd think, is that the conclusion I draw? It's the world's full of opinions, right? So if you disagree with the conclusion that's in this presentation, I am more than happy to talk about it, because there's far more than one reality out there. So, okay, so let me crack on. This is I'll start on this slide. This is number 2 originally, and it's essentially we're talking about why across our organizations we need to think about resilience. We need to think about what's going to happen next, because even when I did this this presentation a few months ago, yes, the war in Ukraine was going on. Yes, we had the energy crisis. We had some cost of living issues. What could we say about what might happen next? Nobody realized we were going to be plunged into a sterling crisis and an interest rates crisis. That was all to come. We know, if nothing else, that the world is quite unpredictable, maybe even more unpredictable than ever. We don't really know what COVID is going to do to us this winter, for example, in the Northern Hemisphere. We don't really know what the impact of the energy blockade or the cessation of supplies from Russia to Europe is going to be. We don't know what the weather's going to be like. A cold winter with not much wind, and we could be in lots of different sorts of trouble. And what does that mean? What will the reaction be? What that happen? What effect will that have on the markets? These are all things that, as businesses, we're trying to see. And from a technology point of view, we're trying to understand what we can do to mitigate some of these risks. Okay, so things like the Great Resignation, we've just talked about skills, things like COVID, the economic volatility. These are all things that are going to play into our maybe caution, and maybe what are we going to do about this in our organizations. The impact on business in 2022 of these things, we had a question about where we were going to work. So commercial real estate has taken a hit. Technology investments have been made for remote work. I was talking to CIOs before COVID hit, and of course, quite a few of them had done put in investment into things like Teams and digital transformation of their organizations. And those that had, they were all feeling quite smug in sort of March 2020, was it? Yeah, 2020, I guess, because they weren't the guys all rushing to get this stuff done. Now we're in a situation where lots of people are using tools like we're using today, Zoom, but now they're wondering why they're using something like Zoom. Why aren't they consolidating onto Teams? Because they also had to put in things like 365. These questions are being asked of all sorts of different. These questions are being asked of CIOs, and they're being asked around board tables about, what do we really need? The CIO has been an absolute hero for most organizations in the last couple of years. So what's going to happen next, and what do we need? What do we want? What can we get away with? All of these things are happening. So where we work, who's going to get the work done? How are we going to automate repetitive tasks and therefore free up some of our staff? upskill and cross-skill so that those people who are displaced potentially by automation are still useful, can still perform a role in the organization. We got to think about the business risks that are emerging, security, supply chain fragility. That's supply chains have definitely shortened in the last year or so because of COVID. People are less relaxed about lengthy supply chains. And then of course we had the ship stuck across the Suez Canal, which didn't really help either, right? So we've definitely hit a lot of bumps in the road. And of course, I mean, if none of you have been affected by a ransomware issue in the last 12 months, well, well done, because that's really that's an issue that's happening far more, I think, than we see in the press. I'm sure in this community, of lots of organisations that have suffered ransomware issues. They don't talk about it so much, but it really does happen a lot. In our 2021 survey, the business concerns were, as you would normally expect, around operational efficiency and customer satisfaction. These things are still top of the tree in terms of business concerns, and these are how our technology investments will be focused in future, no doubt. So this was about a survey about hybrid models. So what's going to come out of the next few years? What were the things that came out of the pandemic? And the highest one was remote and hybrid work models. Second one was intelligent digital workspaces. So essentially this is, how do we work? How do we share information? Another one is about employee experience, which I don't know. I think this was maybe one that was higher back then, and maybe has gone a little bit down the chart since then. But certainly there was a focus on how we're going to retain our employees. Lots of reliance on cloud-based services and also automation. So automation had become one of the top issues that we saw, or top trends that we saw coming out of the pandemic. And all of these are impacting things like security models. All of these are impacting the way that we have to organize as CIOs. Physical workspaces as well, more instrumentation, interconnected physical workspaces, intelligent workspaces. I've seen so many leaseholders or landlords and organizations trying to tempt people back into their workspaces. And unless you provide something that's genuinely useful as a workspace, that's flexible, that's comfortable, that's not just a box in a city anymore, just not going to work. The whole real estate business has taken a hell of a shock. And mobile first access, right? Again, I don't know about you, but there's still a long way for me for mobile first access in many organizations. In fact, when I was at IDC, none of our systems were mobile first. They weren't even usable on mobile. Every organization's got some way to go on that. And we see over 1 billion spending on these things by 2024 in the IDC research.
Chris, sorry, just on the employee experience piece.
Yeah.
Did you, in your experience, have you seen how that model has changed over time? Because I think initially, if you weren't offering remote work, people wouldn't join. It was very difficult to retain staff, etc. Then after sort of, as we started going through COVID, people started getting disengaged and started seeing maybe that they could make more money elsewhere. And if they were going to work remotely, those perks of being, engaged was very different. What have you seen across the last sort of 12, 18 months?
Martin, I've absolutely seen that. What you're talking about, I've seen a lot of, in terms of organizations have seen, and they've started to realize that not only do they have to accept that people can work remotely, they can now employ people from different parts of the country, different parts of the world even, to do these jobs if they change their mindset. But of course, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? You also have the potential to lose people. If you're a business in Bournemouth or somewhere where maybe there's a certain amount of activity going on in an IT sense around Bournemouth, but if those people could now work in London or in Birmingham or in Manchester without any issues because they're working remotely, you've got an issue there. And I think what we've also seen is people, the psychological effect of lockdown and the pandemic has made people rethink their priorities around how much time they want to spend in a maybe a toxic environment, even if it's a remote toxic environment, right? We saw at the start of lockdown lots of stories of organizations desperately searching for monitoring software and ways to measure productivity.
And a big rise in mouse jigglers on Amazon.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and I saw a headline about that recently. You know, mouse jiggling. You know, people are defeating their work productivity tools by mouse jiggling. And I always think, you know, I've worked with plenty of people who could quite easily be replaced with a mouse jiggler. But if you're a manager and you don't know the difference between somebody working and somebody who's got a mouse jiggler, then surely this problem is management. It's not.
Yeah, but there's a problem there, and I'm not sure it's the person with the mouse jiggler.
Well, exactly. So you can be in a remote first environment and still be disengaged, still be treated badly, still be managed poorly, still have poor objectives and things like that. So I really do see that this employee experience is being taken seriously by organizations, but it will take some time for it to settle down, I think. And you know, we've seen something I was talking about not so long ago. I wrote a blog about it for Jumar. One of the things that Jumar has done, to take an example, is we have one of the few CA Gen practices in the world. Right, we've got CA Gen. But you have to be even older than me really to remember working on CA Gen. It was like a 4th generation language once upon a time, mainframe language. Lots of governments used it, big organizations, things like payroll. It was like a low code, rapid application and development environment back then. And there's still a lot of this old stuff out there. And GMA is one of the few organizations with the skills and the tools to say, right, we're going to take that CA Gen environment, we're going to modernize it and make it into, recompile it into Java or whatever it might be. But we've got people who are, towards the end of their careers, and we have awareness of people all over the world in this market, and they're suddenly disappearing. They've brought forward their retirement, not because they're suddenly richer than they expected to be, but because their priorities have changed. They're thinking, do you know what? Maybe I don't want to work for a few more years. So people with legacy tech who have had plans to say, okay, well, in 2027 we'll deal with this or whatever, or maybe not even a hard plan, but like, let's see how long we can get away with it. They're really having to think about, we might not be able to get this done. There won't be the capacity in the market to do this. So yeah, it really is an issue, but I'm not sure I could say I know what the answer is, or I could see a genuine pattern yet, but it's definitely something lots of people are interested in. Now, this is an interesting slide because this is a nice IDC slide about how IT spending fared in the 2008 recession compared to how it fared in the COVID downturn. The red dotted line is IT spend, and I guess it's kind of intuitive now when you look at it that IT spend actually outstripped or survived the dip this time, as all organizations realize that the only way out of this, the only way to continue to trade, the only way to build flexibility into their business was to invest in technology. Whereas in 2008 it was much less of a integral, essential thing. So we saw lots of organizations invest in their IT, a lot of them able to continue their business through their investment in IT. And they've kind of realized now that the game is now up in terms of, can we just cut to the bone? The only way to get out of this, the only way to transform it, is to invest in their IT. So the lessons from 2022, right? I'll just flick through that. So we've realized that the traditional approaches to business resilience in IT risk, if we ignore the fact that we're now absolutely reliant on digital technologies, we've got a problem. We've got advanced digital processes now in many organizations. They were more successful in the pandemic. And we also realize that systemic crises are more likely than ever. We're more interconnected, we're more interdependent, lots of things going on. and therefore digital resiliency, which this is an IDC definition, the ability to rapidly adapt to business disruptions by leveraging digital capabilities, not just for business continuity, but to capitalize on the change. What can you do to say, okay, we're going to pivot our business model to do something differently? I'm going to skip through that because that's just a quote. So this is a now there's some graphs coming up here that I think are really interesting, and these might be things that people want to have a think about or maybe comment on, because I do think they tell a story, and the question is what is that story? We can see that in 2022, or at the start of this year, there was a bit of a tipping point on software as a service adoption and public cloud, right? So this has been, I guess, since the late 90s. We've been on this journey. But by the end of 2022, I think it basically says that the spending on applications on software as a service will outstrip those that run on premise. And that's kind of, at that point, enterprises have got a significant portion of their enterprise data on cloud platforms. So that's a complete change in thinking, really, because your ability then to leverage other tools or other ways of processing your data in the cloud, for example, it does give you more flexibility. Of course, it changes the whole cost model and organizations. I don't know about you in the audience, but one of the biggest issues for me that I find in the organizations I've worked with and for over the years is that this move to OPEX rather than CAPEX is not as universally, it's not seized on with glee by the finance guys. They don't like to change their budgeting and their finance models because they like to be able to compare this year with last year and that last year, the year before. It's a big mindset shift for them. So all these things are really being tested now by these tipping points. This one is about by the end of 2023. Again, this is a slightly more maybe subjective point, but this is about spending on digital initiatives in business, in that we'll get to the point where we spend more on digital initiatives than anything else in a business. And again, that might sound like a kind of arbitrary thing to measure, but really, if you think about it, when you're not spending it on paper clips and warehousing and capital equipment and logistics, but you're spending it on technology, that again points to a world which is tipping into this digital first, digitally transformed, if you like, entity where the digital spend outweighs non-digital spend. Now, the question is where do you get the payback? And that's the kind of thing boards are going to be questioning us about, right? And the third tipping point, and again, I think this is another really key one, really, is that the number of FTEs with digital technology skills will outstrip those without them by 2024. So
wow, that's a big stat, really. That took me off guard.
It is, and that to me, when we're talking about things like low code, automation, data analysis, and you're talking about essentially, you're talking about, yes, knowledge workers, people like us, shiny ass people sitting on desks pressing buttons for a living, but also you're talking about people who have done traditionally more warehouse work, engineering work, manufacturing work, who have digital tools in their kit box, but know how to use them and know how to manipulate them and know how to ask for things. The culture has changed in terms of how can we do this better, or can we amend this, can we add this? So that is a big stat, because it essentially suggests, this with the other three suggests that the world has kind of reached this point where the digital aspect is now essentially overtaking the non-digital. And they need some thinking about. So all I'm going to do is leave that one with you in terms of what that might mean. And if we want to talk about it a bit later, that's great. But what it'll also mean is as people get more technologically aware, where they have these skills, they will actually start to ask more intelligent questions, right? They'll ask us. Our job in terms of evangelizing about tech will start to get a little bit easier, because the pull will be greater than the push.
Yeah, certainly less resistance from people who can start seeing the value of these things and build a bit of momentum.
That's a theory, right? So let's see how that goes. So when I did this presentation in Croatia, it was like in a conference center, and I had a big screen behind me. At the start, I played a bit of I don't know whether you watch the Marvel films, but I played a bit from one of the Thor films. Essentially, it's this massive, great action scene with lots of CGI, all sorts of things going on. And basically, I left that there, and I said, why have I showed that? And I think it's because there are certain things that need a level of technology maturity to actually be worth doing. Right? We try and we think we're there, but we're not really. We're kind of still playing at it to a certain point. And if you watch those movies now, you go to watch. Most movies have got heavy CGI in them. They can de-age people. They can make backgrounds and cities appear where they're not. And if you watch things like Marvel, you've got it's incredible, right? But we were doing things like that a while ago. But they looked a bit more like this, right? And for me, like 5 years ago, that was RPA. I was not a fan of RPA back then. I saw it as a kind of player piano scripting, easily fooled into making a mistake. A poor substitute for proper integration, a poor substitute for an integrated development program to say, okay, these applications are going to work together like this, right? And we got, back in the 70s, we had all these different superhero films, and they were pretty ropey, really. They were just, guys in lycra suits. And now, of course, we have this, and it's amazing, right? You no longer have to really suspend your disbelief whilst a fat guy in a Captain America suit runs around. It's a different world now, and I would say that automation technology has kind of reached that tipping point of usefulness, because we have the sensors, we have the data, we have the logs around the applications that we're using, the amount of data we need to automate properly. The automation, the AI and the document recognition and all that kind of thing has reached a point where you no longer have to train a document recognition tool that this is an invoice from this particular company. They start to pick these things up. They know what an invoice is. They know what a purchase order is. They know what a date is, right? The technology has now reached a point where these things are useful in the last couple of years. So things like interactions and requests, like chatbot type affairs, incoming documents, also decision making about where that document should be routed to, or whether it needs to be escalated, etc. Process improvement. These are all things now that automation technology can bring us a genuine benefit. Whereas a few years ago, I think there was a lot of hype, but not really. I didn't think it was really out there. So one thing, and I want it would be nice to know if anybody uses this. One thing that we've seen at IDC, when I was at IDC, we looked at. We thought process mining was a very important step on this journey. So if you don't know about process mining, essentially there are tools that analyze logs from your applications to say, okay, we can see how long it takes people to go through these different processes, and we can see there's a bottleneck here. These things take quite a long time. These things, more people do this thing than that thing, or more people follow this path in your software. And the process mining tools what they try to do is find candidates for automation. Where can we see that decisions are made in a certain way that we can say, actually, this path through this application could be automated, because the user isn't having to do as much input, or they're not having to make as complex a series of decisions. as they may be elsewhere. And we have a process mining playbook about how you find a process to mine. There's a survey here about what business areas are being impacted by process mining. So it's processing operations, supply chain operations. Those are the areas where people were starting to see process mining tools as being useful. And it says there, if the business is not like a competitive area where a mistake can be very costly, where it's a bit more of an admin role, if it's not performing well, if it's largely manual, and actually, but in a kind of contrary way of thinking, if you could make it work better, it would really help the way you do things. It's a bit like that, if only we could get these documents signed off in a more in a faster way, we could make a decision in less than 6 weeks or something. Those are things that you can start to improve with automation. And I've seen 1 or 2 companies have started to really do this, but also I've spoken to companies who have said, do you know what, we've tried it and we didn't really get the benefit out of it. So this is one of these where the research doesn't always tally with anecdotal evidence from my point of view. But I thought I'd leave it in there and ask the question of you guys whether you've seen the process mining tools, if you've used them. I'd be very interested to know.
Again, if anybody wants to jump in and share anything, I suppose just to ask off the back of that then, Chris, in terms of how, if people haven't done any of this process automation, are there any sort of simple steps to how to get started, paving the way for these sorts of things in the future?
Well, I think as I said before, what you've got to think about is what in your organization actually takes up time and but really doesn't use the best of the people's experience that they can bring to bear. I've seen examples in for insurance, for example, where you have automated kind of, have you heard of this concept of a cobot? So not a robot, but a cobot where you're presenting information to people that will be useful. So if there's a lot of claims coming in, if you've got like a very windy day across the country and there's lots of storm damage claims coming in, where the systems are actually presenting the call center people with the right information for storm damage claims that day, and the answers to the kind of questions they're going to be asked. And these things are kind of crowdsourced from previous examples of those days, and you can then build up a knowledge base and a way of assisting people that is not getting in the way of the customer experience, and it's not replacing the person, but it's certainly making them more efficient. Yep. So it's a question of what can you take away from your process, which currently isn't adding value, but with the right use of the data, you can make it more effective. This is about process mining. This particular side, we're talking about how do we identify process performance, how do we detect problems, and how do we build custom processes. Where you've got custom processes and where you've added custom data, that can be sometimes some of the areas where you get the most benefit from how can we automate this, because you are doing something genuinely different from other people. The next slide actually is we've got a case study from Jaguar Land Rover, and they essentially took a center of excellence approach. So to your question, their approach to automation and using process mining is to look, okay, where are the bottlenecks? High frequency, time intensive, high peak impact. If they drew out their 2x2s and said, okay, what are the processes that are going to be affected by this? Purchase to pay was a prime example at JLR. And in their center of excellence project, they reckoned 23 projects got 3 million annualized savings, right? And that was enough of a business case for them to carry on with that as a proposition within JLR. There's another case study here, which MRG, Madalena Red de Gas, they're essentially trying to improve their customer experience, right? So they added automation to essentially build things like text to speech and bring in chatbots, reducing the call volumes, and bringing in WhatsApp channels and things like that. Again, we present this at IDC as a great case study, and there's some detail behind it, I'm sure. I haven't read this one in detail. I'd question whether reducing call volumes by 37% depends who you are. Just, you know, it might not be that that's great for the customer. It might be they're given up in disgust, but depends what metric you're trying to hit, right? And I'm sure for MRG they've done the thing that worked for them. But again, it's about what can you see in your organization that actually, if you could just shave, you know, some time off it because it's widespread, or you might need to scale it or whatever. These are the areas that you can put a bit of automation around. So we say, you know, one of the also I work with a company which was not taking a centre of excellence approach for automation. It was working with it as a centre of practice. So this wasn't somewhere where you went with your problem and they sorted it out for you. The centre of practice was essentially, okay, we think this is a candidate for automation, and these guys would look at it and go, yeah, we think that's good. You want to look at this tool, you want to look at this tool. This is the way we would do it. They would put things like, you know, how do you categorize your data and say, okay, what are the data? What's the data that we will use for automation, and what's the data that we definitely won't? What's the data that we will allow for low code application, for example, and what data will we not allow? It's that kind of governance around it, a centre of practice approach can take. But we say that, you know, it's not an IT tool, it's a business tool at the end of the day. Business has got to want it and ask for it and be engaged. You've got to build it for a purpose. You've got to agree the vision of what it's going to achieve. And also you need to be measuring what comes out of it. You need to agree what those improvement metrics are. What if this works, what will be better? And so that we're actually measuring something that's going to have an effect. You have to do your data governance. You have to make sure you understand what's going in and what's coming out. And I think this is something that we're all very aware of. You've got to put the user at the center. This is not a technology sell. This is about how is it going to improve the life of users.
And Chris, just on that, I mean, in your travels, have you seen sort of these things popping up in more of a shadow IT kind of way, where I suppose your power users have got a bit excited about maybe some of the features that are available to them and maybe started using them without the support of IT?
I would say that that's probably the majority of the earlier use cases, if I'm honest. That some of the early RPA use cases that I saw were very definitely they were kind of sold to business line management, right? They weren't sold into IT. They were sold as a technology you could implement without the need for IT, because IT would provide all the applications. We don't have to worry about that, because we'll just, we'll screen scrape and we'll build these things to automatically populate screens. So you don't have to worry about those guys. Now, of course, then a field would change on the screen, and it would all fall apart, or you'd do your tests, and then you'd run a few examples, and it would all work fine. So you press the button, it would do 1 million transactions, and then you suddenly find that one department had used that field for something completely different than what it was intended for, and everything would fall apart, and you'd end up with a load of shitty information being put into other systems. Not good, and a hard lesson for a lot of organizations. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is almost like classic shadow IT. How do we, IT, we've been to IT. You know what the worst thing about IT is the slow no, right? We want to be able to integrate this system and that system. Okay, we're going to put a BA on it. We're going to put a team around it. It's going to cost you, £50,000, and we'll in 9 months' time we'll come back and go, no, it's not really our strategic. It's not what we're doing in our organisation, and that's so frustrating for end users. So frustrating for teams trying to find a way to be more competitive, to be more efficient. So a vendor comes in and goes, yeah, don't worry about those guys. We can do that for you. And it'll cost you 10,000 today, and we can do it in 6 weeks. Of course, what they're going to do, they're going to say yes. And that's why the likes of the organizations I've talked about that built centers of excellence, centers of practice, they realized that was absolutely the problem. They had to get their hands around it. They had to find ways to say, yep, okay, if you want to do it, we'll help you, but we will help you use the right tool, use the right approach. Just before we started, Martin, you and I had a quick conversation. We were talking about Uipath and things like Power Automate. So you've got these big, heavy, kind of industrial size scale tools like Uipath, which have been very, very successful. And one of my favorite vendors, Uipath, I really think they understand what they're trying to do. They've got some really good tooling, but it is expensive, and it does needs feeding and watering in quite a substantial way. And if you're doing large scale automation and you've got a need to see that scale out, potentially you might want to put 10, 20, 30% more business to a certain area by scaling out your RPA, by scaling out your automation. Very, very good tooling, but it does need looking after. Whereas the Power Automate world, where you're looking at sort of lower end, low code type of automations around simpler processes, you're not paying so much for that. In fact, if you've got certain Microsoft licenses, right, it's all included. They're not daft. The guys at Microsoft, they know what they're doing in that regard. And I've been talking to people over the last 2 or 3 years about automation. First, as I say, I was I was very skeptical. In fact, over the years, I've started to see it get a lot better. But in the last, 18 months, I've started to see this drift from things like Uipath, where people ran into that area of tech. They saw great opportunities, they saw great promise, but they really didn't understand the costs and the effort. And now they're moving to things like Power Automate, because actually they get more bang for their buck in terms of those small scale automations than they were than the bigger ones. I do think it's horses for courses, and it's a bit like containerization, right? If you know that your application is going to need a lot of scaling and it's going to be a big, beefy application, you might want to start with that containerization approach. But if all you're ever going to do is a hello world, why would you go to the expense and the complexity of containerization? So it's a bit like that question about where is this going? So I think I'm getting to the end of this now, actually, where we, the point was that the world is a tipping point. Automated use of data is the future. We are going to be doing it, but we need to be able to embrace it. We need to understand it, and we also need to be able to educate our non-techie stakeholders about it, because if we don't, they will all run off and they'll be tempted into doing this by other people. And I think, Martin, there ends the lesson.
Superb. Thank you very much.
And they see that it's got Mark Dowd's name in there, because that was the last thing I did for IDC, and I knew that I wasn't going to be around to answer any questions. So I'm going to end that now. I'm going to stop sharing.
No problem.
And if you've got any questions in the audience, hello, everybody.
I have already set you guys, so if you want to come off mute or put your hand up or use the text chat channel, please do feel free. Realize this has just been Chris and I chatting along, but hopefully you've heard some of the bits that you would have asked anyway, but please feel free to shout.
Don't be shy. Come on. It'd be very lonely, just me and Martin up here.
Just one whilst we wait for people to have a think. Have we started seeing any of the limitations of RPA yet? I mean, is it a bit too early to tell?
I think the limitations are inherent in the technology. Okay, RPA at its purest is essentially relies on interfaces being consistent, data being consistent, and yes, you can put some tools around it, you can put some intelligence around it, say, okay, this doesn't look like I think it should look, but that does take a lot of effort. It takes a lot of training data to be able to say, okay, I know what this really should look like, because the more you build those caveats into the system, the more often it's going to kick something out which is fine, but somebody then has to manually process. So I think the technology in itself is always going to be relatively limited because of the complexity of the environments in which it works. That's why at the moment we're definitely seeing the kind of lower end, smaller end automations taking priority, because they can be implemented, they can be tested, they're kind of banded, and then when you don't want to use that anymore, you can throw it away and do something else. It's not throwing away a massive investment. And I would, my original issues with RPA about it being like a poor substitute for proper integrated data transformation approach, kind of still that still holds water for me, really. And if you do use this as I heard of people putting RPA tools like Blue Prism and Uipath in as kind of greenfield sites. I just couldn't understand it. It's like, no. What are you doing? But it's like, because we want to use robots. Okay. I don't. So yes, there are limitations, I think, but I think it's inherent in the complexity of the data and the way, of course, that things change. We will always evolve our business process, and we'll always evolve the type of data we're using.
Okay. Have we got any other questions coming in? I've got another one, but I don't want to hog the limelight. But if anybody, feel free to jump off mute and ask away. I'll give you a few seconds to do it. I'll start asking away, and then if anybody else wants to jump in, please do feel free. In terms of testing approaches, so are you seeing any sort of changes in the way a QA team maybe approaches how they test maybe traditional application development versus RPA? Any different tooling we should be aware of?
Well, that's interesting. In terms of testing, I definitely see it's definitely a bit more of a community sort of user-based thing where you're really asking the users to say, look, does this make sense to you? I've not seen many formal methods of RPA testing in that sense. I've certainly seen some quite cool, more traditional software testing tools using automation and using AI. Like there's a company called Tricentis, which has got quite a cool. Again, if you think about the way document management works with the AI and automation, you're saying, okay, look, this is a form, and the AI is trained to go, okay, yeah, I can see it's got the word invoice on it for a start, so that's great. I can see some dates. I think that's the invoice date. I think that's the invoice number. I think that's the terms or whatever. That technology has been used for. That technology is also being used for testing now. So the Tricentis platform will actually look at a screen that's been produced, and if somebody's moved a field, it will know it's moved the field, right? It's not just going to try and click a mouse on a place where there wasn't a field anymore. I've seen some pretty cool implementations of that, actually. So that's where I can see automation in the kind of loosest sense being used. But no, I have to admit, I haven't seen anything formal or methodological come out that says, okay, this is how to test an RPA.
Yeah. So I'm with you in terms of being able to see how a QA team have maybe applied some of their testing processes to RPA. It still seems very much it's going to be the people that would have done it manually are going to test it. But that's interesting. We have had some questions come in. Thank you very much. So I'm just going to read them out just for everyone's benefit. So what are the best tools to use in process mining in readiness for automation feasibility? So I think you've mentioned a couple, but
yeah, I mean, I think the one that people are mostly seeing as a bit of a market leader is the one that Uipath are starting to bundle with there. I can't remember the name of it for the life of me, but the Uipath have got like some pretty cool process mining tools in their toolkit, and that would be where I would. That's, as I said, I wish I was on commission, but I'm not. I do think Uipath, are the best of the vendors out there, and they're the people I'd go and talk to first. There are other process mining tools. I'm afraid I don't have any idea off the top of my head what they are, but essentially you need to look at what your use case is and say, okay, where has this tool shown its value before? Because they've all got their own pros and cons, right? They are essentially data, they're crunching data from logs.
Yep.
They're looking for patterns. They're looking for exceptions and things like that. So they're not actually that complex tools. It's just about, how can you use that data then to inform your automation decisions.
And quite a few of them, even I know the Uipath community version comes with these things built in as well.
Oh, really?
So you can go and have a play for free. And that's how they hook you in with quite a few of the vendors, isn't it? Is that they give you the option to sort of play around with it as a developer or as a freemium type model. Then as soon as you actually want to put it to work, there's quite a hefty license fee. But I know certainly from experience from a few years back there, Uipath especially have got a really good support learning network that you can certainly ask away with questions, and a lot of resources to be able to go and do it. They've even got a Uipath University as well, so you can actually go and do most of these things for nothing. And just seeing a couple of others. So is it good practice to part automate processes involving human interactions? So sort of the cobot type approach that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I would say that would where I would always start, because automation it's one of those things you learn how to do, and you learn what kind of things are the most appropriate targets. It's something that the organization kind of culturally gets, and if you're going to start with it, then you have to start with something that people are fundamentally involved in, because for me, RPA, particularly RPA, it's like having lots of very, very simple people working for you. They still need managing.
Yep.
Right. They're going to do very simple process, and they're going to most of the time get it right, because they're going to do exactly what you told them. But sometimes they're going to get it wrong because you haven't explained this particular exception, or something will happen that's never happened before, and they're just going to. And if they don't recognize that that's something different, they'll try to do it the way they've been taught. And you need to, you do need to have that human interaction. And once you start to do that, once you start to build those things out, those people who get used to working with the robots, they become more experienced. They become more useful in understanding how the next iteration will be developed. So no, I think it's absolutely good practice to do that.
And then our final question, please keep them coming if there's any more, but similar to earlier around, can people use an RPA to test another RPA?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think if you think about the test automation tools, which I always forget,
like Selenium or
Selenium, exactly.
Yeah.
That's the classic one, isn't it? Essentially, RPA tools, the older RPA tools are nothing more than Selenium, with a slightly shinier hat on. They're just scripting tools. And so absolutely, you can use RPA, you can use Selenium, or you can use a more sophisticated version that's maybe an RPA to test an RPA. I think it makes absolute sense to do that.
And a lot of the automated online tools actually have got that under the hood. Anyway, it is essentially a nice UI on top of Selenium. It's certainly quite a lot of the online testing tools that are available now. But yes, absolutely.